My great-grandfather had become a Bible student about 1900. My wife's great-grandmother, it would be, was associated with Pastor Russell in the 1880s. We had a long tradition within that organization. My grandmother was baptized in 1908. We went through the persecution in Canada of 2 world wars. In the First World War, all Watchtower literature was banned. In the Second World War, it was illegal to be a Jehovah's Witness, and if you had a King James version of the Bible without comments published by the Watchtower Society, you could be sent to prison. This at the behest of the Catholic Church. The flag salute issue was burning at the time, and I was a boy in school, and I suffered for this. The police came to my parents' home in the Second World War, to my grandparents' home in the First World War. We underwent a great deal of persecution as Jehovah's Witnesses. This was one of the things, I think the major thing, which kept me associated with the organization for as long as I did associate. But there was something else about our experience that was different. I never had the fear of displeasing the organization in the way that most of you, who are younger than I am, did. Why? Because I grew up in a family that was always willing to question certain things that the Watchtower taught. I remember as a small boy hearing my grandmother read about some of Rutherford's false prophecies. And I said to her, "Oh, Gran, that couldn't be true." And she said, "Yes, Jimmy, it was." Before she died as an old woman, she was about 87, she told my wife, "You know, I think it's utter foolishness to teach that the saints were resurrected in 1918. And when Rutherford came out with his doctrine that Adam wouldn't have a resurrection, I remember her telling very openly, "Well, I don't know whether Adam will have a resurrection or not. I leave that to Jehovah. But I'll tell you this, if he does have a resurrection, I want to be there to welcome him." You see, there was this openness. And although I considered myself a loyal Jehovah's Witness, there was never a time in my life that I was afraid to question. And the reason for this was that I was taught by a family that felt that you turned to the Scriptures and you examined everything in harmony with the Scriptures, and if the Watchtower taught something that wasn't in the Scriptures, you ignored the Watchtower. That was very rare. But that came from that older tradition, you see, that Schnell speaks about. And I grew up with that, and I heard many of the tales of what had happened in the past, and consequently, when I got to be a young man, I wasn't afraid to go on to university. When I did, it was so many years ago now, that I shocked them so much that they didn't know what to say and they didn't bother me particularly. Later on, they began to bedevil me when I became a university professor, and they persecuted our older son terribly and our nephew for going to university. In fact, our nephew dropped out because of them. And they went through pain that I didn't go through. I remember too in 1966 when the Freedom of the Sons of God book, I believe it was, came out, and with the chart in there about 1975. We didn't go for some reason. We were ill, didn't go to a district assembly, and my mother-in-law came home with the book and was telling us all about 1975. The end was coming in 1975. And I said, "This is ridiculous, this can't be. Really, they didn't say that, surely?" And she said, "Yes, they did. Here's the book. You go in and take a look at it." Well, I went in and I looked at this chart, and I was in our bedroom, and I took the thing up like this, and I threw it on the bed, and I said out loud, "The damn fools, will they never learn?" You know, I knew all about 1925, what had happened in 1925. And why then did we stay with the organization? Well, I think we would have left shortly thereafter. But then came the early 1970s. I went on a sabbatical leave to Spain. The new elders system came into existence, and there was a tremendous emphasis on conscience. And of course, I didn't know it at the time, but this was largely the work of Raymond Franz. And for a few brief years there, in the early 1970s, they defanged the circuit overseers. We had the responsibility of pastoral care. shepherding, going out, treating people differently. And it was for a very brief time. I called it the Prague Spring. Remember, it was like Dubček in Czechoslovakia, and then the Soviet tanks rolled in. Well, that was the way it was. That was the way it was for a brief period of time. And during that time, I became an elder and was very enthused because I thought that there was going to be change, that there was going to be a difference. I largely ignored 1975. I didn't say anything about it because you didn't dare. You didn't dare dissent. But in fact, you were not expected even to keep quiet. You were expected to say, oh yes, that's what the society is teaching. Well, I didn't, and I was looked askance at by some of the circuit overseers. But we stayed, and then things began to close down again. By this time, I had written the history of Jehovah's Witnesses in Canada, the struggle for civil liberties, and although there are certain things in that book that I would certainly change today, because I bought some of the accounts of the Watchtower Society about their own history, which are quite frankly lies, most of it I would defend to this very day because it dealt with civil liberties. Then I began to receive letters from various brothers asking me if I knew about such and such. They were experiencing problems. I was open-minded enough to look into this, and by 1979, I was horrified when the Watchtower Society tried to explain Acts 20:20 as a basis for going from house to house, because they had reversed themselves on this. They bobbed off one of the statements. Actually, I went to the Brooklyn Bethel. I was doing research on what became Apocalypse Delayed, my book. And I was so distraught by some of these things that I went to see two brothers there. I went to see Colin Quackenbush, who filled my ears with stories of the viciousness of Nathan Knorr, he and his wife. And then I went to see Raymond Franz. I could tell that Raymond Franz was in terrible pain, but at the time he said, well, let's wait. And the message I got was, well, isn't this the truth? Isn't this Jehovah's organization? And won't Jehovah set it right? By that time, I couldn't wait. I was angry, and I had been partaking at Memorial for some years before this. And I said, well, if I am a member of that faithful and discreet slave class, I have a right to speak to these men. Ha! Try and speak to them. The doctrine of the faithful and discreet slave is the greatest myth that was ever created. Why it makes the idea of Peter being the first pope look quite historical. In any case, I wrote a long 8-page letter, which eventually resulted in my disfellowshipment. 83 people in our city leaving the witnesses, including 2 other elders, 3 other ministerial servants, a number of pioneers, a number left in Ontario, a number left in Arizona. And we decided that because of their wickedness, we would publicize this from one end of Canada to the other. It shocked them so much that they sent Fred Franz up to Calgary to attack us publicly. And the papers came to me and said, well, are you worried about what he says, that you're going to be destroyed eternally? And my reply was, well, his batting average as far as prophecy is concerned is 0, so I'm not really concerned, you see. Ultimately, I was disfellowshipped, and my disfellowshipment resulted in a veritable riot, quite literally. I didn't go. I sent them a note that I wasn't going to the Inquisition. My son took it. My wife and several others went as witnesses on my behalf. They put them in a separate room, and then when I didn't show up, my witnesses got up and walked out. Well, they brought people in from all over the place. They had gone out and solicited letters against me. I was such a terrible person. I was saying things against the society. I had questioned a variety of things. I had questioned the fact that you don't gain salvation by the preaching work, which I sure had. Salvation is a matter of grace. It's not a matter of works. And the result was that eventually they came pouring out of the Kingdom Hall. Well, some of the people who had come over to our house, who were leaving with us, some of the elderly sisters said, let's go back and see what's happening. And our son went back there. Well, I hadn't known anything about this, but a brother down in Washington, Richard Raleigh, known to many of you, had called the Alberta Report magazine. I was a professor, nationally known. I had been the president of the Canadian Society of Church History. And this was quite a thing. The papers wanted to get in on it. Well, when the witnesses came pouring out of the Kingdom Hall, the city servant charged down the street yelling like a banshee after this photographer. And the poor man was so frightened that he ran and hid and finally went over to the university. He was a student and went into a dark room and closed the door and locked it. And my son had gone over with these others, and another fellow started charging out the door, and my son said, leave him alone. He's on the sidewalk. He has a perfectly legal right to be here. This is something the witnesses should have understood. This one fellow doubled up his fist, a man about 60, and hit my son in the face. My son has a quick temper and was 28 years old at the time, and he struck him back, and the fellow ended up 3 days in the hospital. The witnesses tried to charge him with assault. The police investigated it and said, well, he started it, so there are no charges on either side. And from then on, the whole thing was publicized. A number of my students went to one of the other Kingdom halls and put up a sign, free boxing lessons, memories only. Well, this gets away a bit from the story of disfellowshipping, where it came in. Well, the fact is, as it exists today, it came in with the Moyle trial. Many of you know about Olie Moyle. Olie Moyle was the society's lawyer, and he had fought many cases on behalf of the witnesses. There's an excellent book out in the United States now on the civil liberties cases that the witnesses fought in World War II by a man by the name of Sean Francis Peters. Excellent book, which also shows their meanness. And Moyle simply wrote a personal letter to Rutherford, left it on the mantel shelf, and said, hey, things are going on here at Bethel that shouldn't go on. There's excessive drinking, there are bad, dirty stories being told, there's favoritism, and you're responsible to see that this is cleaned up. Well, Rutherford, instead of taking counsel or reproof, turned on Moyle, had the whole board of directors of both societies condemn him. Then they called him a Judas in the Watchtower magazine, and practically destroyed Moyle's legal business in Wisconsin, where he'd returned to. And Moyle took them to court and won, and was able to collect $15,000 in court costs for the Watchtower Society in, I believe it was 1944. It's an amazing thing. If you haven't read the transcript of record of this case, I would counsel all of you to, because it gives a picture of the inner workings of the Watchtower Society like nothing else does. It's an amazing work. And it shows the evil of the organization and what Rutherford was like in a way that nothing else does. Rutherford was dead at the time, of course. But immediately thereafter, at the behest of the Society's lawyers, particularly Hayden Covington, they set up the present system of what they first called disfellowshipping committees. They didn't call them judicial committees, they called them disfellowshipping committees in the first place. Now, what are these committees? Well, the interesting thing is that I've done a lot of historical study. My master's degree in history was on the High Middle Ages, and naturally I was intrigued by the Inquisition. The judicial committees of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society are exact replicas of the Holy Office of the Inquisition of the Middle Ages and the Spanish Inquisition of the modern period. I've done a lot of work in the Spanish Inquisition. The only difference is that the inquisitors were better trained and they kept records. Now, why did this occur? Why did they set up these judicial committees, which are completely in violation of biblical principles? You remember the ancient Israelites had their trials at the gate, and 2 witnesses had to be brought forward, and there had to be protections, which were nearly as complete as courts of common law. The only thing in British and American and Canadian history that's comparable to the judicial committees is the Court of Star Chamber. And